All right, we are live for EQ Day 2024. And
Yeah,
I'm here with Joe Gilder. Hey, Joe, what's up? I'm so happy to see you.
it is super fun to be here. I'm inside an EQ right now. It feels amazing.
Yeah, yeah, you're one with the frequency spectrum. It's kind of like being one with energy overall. That's what frequencies are, you know?
That's all frequencies are. You just the higher the frequency, the more stuff happens. Yeah,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something.
You bounce up and down, bounce up and down. Uh, all right, so there is a light formal schedule, I guess. I started this, I think, 3 years ago. I think I've done this 3 or 4 years ago. The first year, did a 3-hour live stream about EQ, and
That's that's a lot of EQ.
yeah, that was a lot, and but I was surprised that I managed to talk the entire time, and I had rotating cast of characters come in and talk, but this time we're maybe gonna do 1 hour and a half of that. So
Okay.
and I mean, it is the topic that most people cannot get enough of. So I'm glad people are here. People are here from all over. Oh, I just opened the comment section. There's tons of people saying hi. Hi, everyone. David Hicks, Kinji, Dan Holder, Morten from Norway. There's Joe Gilder saying hi to everyone too.
That guy.
Yeah. And so I told my email list what I was gonna tell them, so I better keep my promises in that regard. And make sure that I put that up here so I can remember it. And then we have some questions from subscribers as they sent in. I just emailed you that, so we'll go through that. And those of you that are here, you get special treatment, and because you're the best and you took time out of your day to hang out with us, and so we just want to talk to you and answer your questions, and all about EQ. Feel free to ask any other questions. We can, if it devolves into random things about, I don't know, Nordic trolls, we can talk about that, but maybe that won't be fun for everyone involved.
It's funny to your point about how EQ is the thing everybody asks about. When I started Home Studio Corner 15 years ago, one of my first courses, I was going to make one on just how to use EQ and one on compression, understanding EQ, understanding compression.
I
And I
remember those courses.
yeah, a long time ago. And I remember thinking compression's going to be the one that people will go nuts over because compression's confusing, and but understanding EQ was always way more popular than the compression one. And at the time I was surprised by it, but it makes total sense.
Yeah. There's a sense of being like, you can hear how much it shapes the sound. It's easier to hear because compression is, you kind of have to like really know what those, how to squeeze the tones with compression, and it does do a lot, but it is more complex and not as easy to manipulate in the same regard, I believe. So yeah. All right, let's talk about. We have some questions. Let's start with questions. I got this from a reader. Let's see, a few here. For a good definition and unmasking in the low end, is it better to apply simple low cuts or alternatively low shelves in all instruments, except of course for kick, bass, and particular low frequency sounds? Some people advocate low shelves, stating that they preserve some useful harmonic content. All right, let's kick it off with filters versus shelves, I guess, when it comes to taming low end. What's your stance on that?
So that's a good question. I think I'm so filters versus shelves. That's the first question. I tend to like both in different contexts, but I like the idea of a shelf because it's more general, it's more vague. So like, or it's not vague, it's just I'm turning up this frequency and everything below it, so I'm just kind of almost taking that whole chunk up or down.
Yeah.
And so like if there's certain bumps in that range that are too much, we can deal with that. But like, I like the idea of just the idea of a shelf is super simple, or like a very simple 3-band EQ that's 2 shelves and 1 parametric in the middle. Like that's super simple. So I like that. Filters, they have their purpose and they make sense. At one point, I would have been the person who would say high pass everything but kick and bass. I don't feel that way anymore, and we can talk about that. But I think they certainly serve a purpose, and it's nice that they can slope things off, and you can kind of find that sweet spot that gets rid of whatever the thing is you're trying to get rid of.
Right. Yeah, I remember reading about this and this making a lot of sense to me. When it all depends on like what your goal is, right? So if you're trying to get rid of low end and you just don't want it at all, there's no reason to use a shelf, because even if you are taking everything down, if you're decreasing the gain of that shelf like all the way down, almost so that it looks like a filter, you're still not cutting everything out. You're still leaving content in there. And I don't know, I don't have the math degree to know how much that affects the harmonic content, the second, third, fourth order harmonics of the signal, if those frequencies are still left in there. That's why I've always kind of like, if you don't want the low end in there, just take it out. Don't reduce the volume. Just get rid of it. And so yeah,
because you never know if like if you go like wimpy on it, and then there's a compressor in the chain later that brings it back out, you've basically like not accomplished anything. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
Exactly. Yeah, because like you add something else, you because I tend to, and I tell this to my one-on-one students whenever I'm like walking through a mix with them, I always say like, all right, I'm going to walk through this mix with you and I'm going to show you one plugin after the other. That does not mean that I put those plugins one after the other in during the mixing. I jump around a lot and I'm like listening, adapting, reacting. So like, oh, I didn't start the drum bus with like a multi-band compressor right there. It was a solution to an issue that I encountered later, you know. And so if you add a compressor and you're cranking that compressor, you're just increasing that low end that you thought you had taken out, but you didn't take out because you just shelved it instead of cut it. You didn't take it completely, cut it out, right? And so the order of operations are hugely important.
Yeah, it's like there's the theory of it, and then there's the practice. Like I was doing a mix the other day, and I had 3 different EQs. Not that I couldn't have done it with one, but I was just at the point where I really just wanted to shape the overall sound of the thing. And if I did it earlier in the chain, it wouldn't work the same as doing it right at the end, where I'm just shaping the final thing, the final touches. And like, yes, you could look at that and say that doesn't make sense. But in the workflow process, it made perfect sense, because I didn't want to undo anything I'd already done. I just wanted to do that final kind of shaping thing. Right. To his point, the question, whoever's question about kind of either high passing or low shelving all instruments except for kick and bass. It's common advice. I used to give that advice. I don't love it. I don't know how you feel about it. I'm not a big... Go for it. What's your thoughts on it?
It's good general practice, but like when you say filter out, that mean like, what does that mean? Does it like, is that 60 hertz? Is that 100 hertz? Is that, you know, I had a filter on a vocal up to 170 hertz the other day and sounded fine. I filter the bass up sometimes to 40 hertz. So like I still filter the bass to get rid of, it's all about just getting rid of what you don't want. But that advice is basically sort of a check your bases, or like make sure that you're what's the term here? You're just like double checking and making sure that you're not letting some unwanted bass through. And for home recordings, sometimes this is good advice because you get rid of like a bunch of garbage rumble. That could be like feet tapping, or just like hum from your air conditioner, or from like the truck that's outside. And so in that regard, definitely. But you have to have a reason for it.
I think that's the big piece. I think for me, it became an automatic thing, and I've tried to remove a lot of automatic things from my workflow because it's just more work. Like I'm gonna high pass the shaker track, even though it doesn't have any low end there. To like, it's not a like. Yes, technically, according to that rule, we should do that.
Yeah.
I'm more of a if I don't hear it, fine. And yes, like there's an acoustic guitar, and maybe I didn't notice it was there. Whatever. But you could also go the other way and say if you're throwing a lot of high pass filters, there's theoretically things it's doing to the sound, phase shift or whatever that I don't honestly care that much about.
Yeah.
But that could be a part of the argument. The bigger picture is I would much rather just like that idea of I have to remove all the low end from the other stuff to make the kick and bass be prominent. I disagree with that fundamental like assertion that you have to do that. Like, yes, if all your tracks are muddy, then yeah, that's true.
Right.
But if you recorded them well, you may not need to, right? It may already be fine in the low end. It's not something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and let's not forget that it may have been recorded with a mic that had a roll-off.
Yep, or preamp.
So you're just like adding a filter for no real reason, right? Because there's nothing there anyway. I do think that there's sort of when it comes to like time saving techniques and stuff like that, like I use a mix template. I have my easy mix approach class that shows you how to make a mix template. There's downloadable mix templates in there that you can, that have certain catch-all plugin chains. And a lot of times, especially in the sends, like on my reverb buses, there's always a filter on the lows and the highs. So like, I think that's like more, I'll stand my ground on that rule more than on the track itself, because
100%.
muddy reverb is just, it's gonna ruin your mix so fast. And the slappy high end like reflections of the reverb are almost as bad.
Yeah, that low end piece, you're right, and it's so hard it's such a hard problem to discover because you're over there EQing the vocal, thinking that's your problem, but it was really the reverb, and that's once you figure it out, it's like the fog has been lifted. But man, that's frustrating. So yeah, I'm rolling all kinds of low end off of reverb just by default. So yeah, I agree.
And so like EQing and like when you're parallel processing, which I think once you discover parallel processing, your mixes will like instantly improve. Once you understand that blending of two different tracks, you maybe like, for instance, drum compression in parallel, right? And you just smash your drum bus in parallel, blended underneath. Obviously a very common trick, but you'd be surprised how many people don't know that. But I tend to often EQ things in parallel too, because sometimes, let's say you smash a drum bus and you're blending it underneath, maybe that all that boxiness that you had EQ'd out, now that compressor is pushing all those frequencies back into the game. So you have to EQ that out to shape your tone, shape the tone of the parallel chain.
Yeah, I tend to not do a lot of parallel unless I just bump up to a problem I can't solve without it. Yeah. But I remember for years reading, it's like any interview in Sound on Sound where they talked about their chain, whether it was a vocal or drum, seems like they were always talking about doing some sort of parallel thing, duplicating the track and doing different things. Or like you'd hear guys talking about taking the snare and making 5 copies of it and doing all this crazy stuff to each one. And I'm thinking, I mean, good for you, bro. But I don't have the patience for that, but that's a thing.
Yeah, I don't. I feel like that's overkill. Let's see. I want to go through, make sure that we cover questions that are from the people that are here. Donnie asked whether I'm feeling dull or harsh. I can be often very harsh, but that's just my sort of abrasive Nordic upbringing. I'm almost as bad as the Dutch. They are like way more blunt than almost anybody else. Made fun of in a very fun way through the Ted Lasso show. I don't know if you've ever watched Ted Lasso, but there's a Dutch soccer player on that team, and he like epitomizes the Dutch stereotype of being like a little bit too blunt. So yeah, I can be harsh. Tough love, I like to say.
I mean, you placed me right under the
Right,
the
right,
harsh section. So whatever that means.
right. This you can't see the whole image, but people have seen it. I use it all the time. So and it's a pretty and drastically sort of crazy curve that is on that EQ, and there's like a huge silly inside Easter egg joke about that curve, because the preset, you almost can't see it. The preset here is in the blue box in the middle there is Langspiel, which is an awful sounding Icelandic traditional instrument. And so my thinking was like, okay, we'll just like make this a joke that a lot of people do not get, and then I get a lot of flack for it on Facebook or for online. But it's like, if I needed to make Langspiel sound good in a mix, I would probably have to EQ it as drastically as it looks on the thing.
That's fair.
Yeah. Let's see here. Can you explain the Q value? What does that number actually mean? I'll let you take this one, and I'll have
I couldn't remember, so I Googled it.
Yeah.
I thought it stood for quality. It technically stands. It technically stands for quality factor.
Okay.
And it's like a formula. It's the ratio of center frequency to half power bandwidth, whatever that means.
Yeah.
So someone who knows math will say, I know what that means, but for the rest of us, it's just width.
Yeah.
Is that what your focus control is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say. So I rebranded Q
Smart.
as focus, and that's what the focus knob there does. It just basically does. So like if the focus is at 0 and you increase those analog buttons, it's like a very broad bandwidth. And one thing too is like bandwidth and Q are the same thing, but you describe them in opposites.
Yeah.
So a high Q or high quality factor means a narrower bandwidth, right? So just like low pass filtering is in reverse, it's all very confusing. Audio engineering is hard.
But I can't bring myself to say low cut. Even like Studio One stock EQ, it's marked LC for low cut, but I still say high pass, which I'm sure is incredibly frustrating. Like, what is he talking about? I can't even find that on the EQ, but
right,
it is what it is.
Yeah. Let's see. Anything else here in the chat? EQ the parallel drum bus with linear phase. I never use linear phase unless I'm mastering. Is that? Do you? When do you use linear phase?
Never. I don't even own a linear phase EQ, so I'm good.
I'm sure there is a version in Studio One, right? There's probably a button somewhere on the
All
EQ.
I know is the latest version of their EQ has a linear phase low cut.
Okay.
But that's it. I don't think anything else is linear phase.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like the common wisdom is use linear phase for mastering because it does less smearing when you're boosting, and there's more, it's basically more math involved, but also like adds slight timing issues, so that if you use it in a mix, it actually will delay the signal a little bit, which can sound cool if you are actually looking to like maybe do maybe use a it might work. Now I'm just pontificating on this stuff, but let's say you have you didn't double track your guitars, right? And so you copied the signal and you left and right, and you pan them left and right, but it's the same signal, so they just sum immediately to mono, and it doesn't sound wide, right? You could hypothetically EQ one of those signals with linear phase EQ, which adds a tiny bit of time discrepancy, and then if you EQ it, you'll also change the sonic makeup of it, and at that point, the I guess you would call it maybe the Haas effect, or like how it will differentiate the same signal there will be different enough for the width to appear, basically the psychoacoustic width.
But I will say, I'm on the other side. I think too many people do that and they ruin things because they delay it a tiny amount to where they think it's stereo, and then if you listen in mono, it completely disappears, or all the low end goes away. Like, I know you said this at the beginning, but just double your guitars.
Yeah.
Don't fake your way to stereo.
Totally.
But yeah, linear phase it's beefy. It uses up a lot of processing.
Yeah.
It seems.
Totally.
There's an email question that says, is it important to always level match any EQ moves in order to have a fair A/B comparison? In other words, to avoid the loudness deception.
Right.
What you think?
I think, well, if you're prone to boosting like I am, everything's going to sound either like immediately worse or way better if you don't level match the output. Because what you're doing, if you're boosting, you're just adding a bunch of gain to that frequency. You're essentially adding dBs onto the output so that the signal is going to be louder, which is going to make it cut through the mix better because it's just louder. It might sound better too, but you don't necessarily know it completely until you've maybe lowered down the output gain to match the input output gain. It's like good gain staging in general, because if you just keep adding gain to stuff, you're just gonna start overloading your mix bus. The EQ actually has the audio issues EQ actually has automatic gain compensation on. Let me see if I can pull up a version of it and share my screen. Let's this template while this template loads. But I actually, funnily enough, I was asked to put it on, or like some user asked for it as a feature. So I was like, all right, yeah, let's put automatic gain compensation on. I never really use it, but some people might find it useful. And then I actually started using it, and it actually does help a lot because it enables you to really boost those knobs, especially the knobs of the analog character there, because even if you boost, so if you don't have the gain compensation on, if you boost, you're just going to hear more of that frequency, right? Versus if you have automatic gain compensation on, which means that if you boost, that output's going to get lowered relatively. And so you're going to actually hear the true change in the frequency tone of that track relative, or like in at the level that you had already made the rough mix, right? You're not changing the level because hopefully you've balanced your faders and done all of those things first. And now you're shaping your tone, and using automatic gain compensation will help you do that sort of like more, I guess you could call it more truthfully, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. The downside is sometimes what the plugin thinks is technically equal doesn't sound equal.
Right.
So like if you remove a lot of low end, I've had some, like Studio One has the automatic. It's better now, but it used to be if you put a high pass filter, the gain matched volume was perceivably a lot louder because it thinks you removed a lot of energy, I'm replacing it. But really you were removing stuff you didn't want anyway. You wanted the mid-range to stay close to the same. Right. So that's why, like you said you don't use it a ton either. Like I'm more like just a matter, if I turn the EQ on and off and it's a wild difference in volume, then I'll try to balance them out. Yeah. But if like the vocal's not quite bright enough and I add a little high end, I'm not going to turn the vocal down because I added high end. Like I'm trying to make it a little bit louder with the EQ, So it's not like if you get into like making it a rule that I must level match,
right.
It starts to become like school and math versus music. So like, don't have it be massive differences, then you really can't tell, but little bits of where it's a slightly louder or quieter, I'm not as upset about.
Right. And because it's like, it's fine to crank the knobs, Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They're there for a reason. And it goes into actually one of my comments that I was going to mention here. The number one and the number two myths about EQ that I think people need to stop worrying about is that you only should do subtractive EQ. Subtractive EQ is hugely important, obviously, but it's literally only one part of the equation.
It's literally half.
You can go down or you can go up, right? And I think that, because life is all about balance, I think you should also boost. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with boosting what you want. because, for instance, let's see if I can share screen here.
While you're doing that, I'll tell a story about this. The friend of mine was working with a pretty well-known mix engineer in town on a project, and he was sitting in on a mix session and said, like, hey, can we turn the piano up? And what most of us would do is say, sure, we'd go grab the fader and turn it up. But the guy said, okay, you want the piano up. And he stopped and thought about it for a second and listened. And then he went and grabbed an EQ and just turned up like 800 hertz or something. Because that was really where the piano was sitting, and that was really, he kind of interpreted, that's what you're really saying, is you want a little more fullness in that mid-range from that piano. And it did, the end result was it sounded like he wanted it to sound. He heard more piano, but if he had turned the whole thing up, it might have been too much low end, too much whatever else. Because what he really wanted was that mid-range, which is super interesting.
Totally. And it's funny you say that, because I literally did that yesterday with a vocal. I was with a client or with a student, and he was like, can we get the vocals a little bit louder in the verses? And I was like, all right, well, I think it's sitting pretty well. How about we just add a little more 3K and just add a little more clarity so it just comes out a little bit more? And he was happy with that. So it's like not always just when, because you also have to translate what the client is saying, not what they're, what they're trying to tell you, not what they're actually saying. And so, so you have to decipher that in whether he means up in volume or just it needs to be more present. He wants to hear it more. He doesn't necessarily, or they don't necessarily care how. So can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So one thing about the EQ, just to talk about the automatic gain compensation here, it's down here. And it's actually wonderful how when I turn this on and then I can really like crank these buttons, and it'll like, it just feels more truthful how the tone changes. But when it comes to subtractive EQ, obviously, like, let's say you have,
actually, you know what, we can't see the plugin.
All right.
Because it's, I had this problem with Ian.
Oh yeah.
You have to share your whole display for me to see the plugin.
Okay, entire screen. How's that?
Yep, got it. Sorry, I realized, hey, you're just making a lot of motions with your mouse. I mean, if you do it your way, bro. No, that makes more sense now.
But anyway, just to recap, the A here is for automatic gain compensation, and it allows you to sort of crank these things up without feeling like you're actually doing something that looks like this, right? Because on the right EQ here, because like the gain here goes up to 18 dB, which is a lot, but what it's basically doing is if you're cranking this up, it's hypothetically turning this down, right? And so that's what automatic gain compensation is sort of doing. But when it comes to subtractive EQ, obviously subtractive EQ is great. Like, you want to maybe take stuff out, you want to filter stuff out, you want to maybe take out, let's say, 300, or maybe I should use my own EQ to show this, but you should just take out 300, the boxiness. Let's say this is a kick drum, right? There's too much boxiness, and there's bleed from the hi-hat or the snare drum, so you're trying to reduce that there. And then the click of the beater is too metally for you, so you turn 4K down. It's that thing that I've done also, all the time. And so similarly on the EQ here. And so when you do subtractive EQ, this is great, right? And whatever, but people often say, well, you shouldn't boost because it's adding phase irregularities, blah, 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 whatever. But what I like to do is just twist things and push things around until things sound good, regardless of like how much or following blindly in your rules. Because if I were to, so basically at this point in this logic EQ here, I've essentially taken this down by 6 dB, this down by 4 dB, and taken a bunch of low end and high end out. So this signal is going to sound weaker, right? And so you would gain compensate by increasing the gain maybe, or just pushing the fader up. But there is very little difference between like a subtractive EQ that you then have to crank up the gain to hear better, there's very little difference to that, and then just boosting the other areas, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, it's if you think about it in terms of white space, so like you're taking this out, you're taking this out. An alternative way to get to almost the same tone is to just boost these areas and boost the other areas instead, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, in my head, it's almost the subtractive thing is more just a mindset thing than anything. I just naturally approach things of, all right, there's too much going on. What can I get rid of?
yep.
Kind of that minimalist idea. But yeah, there's sometimes you got to boost the highs to get the vocal to sound nice and crispy, and that's delightful.
Yeah. Or cymbals or air or whatever, right? It's basically about like, don't, like, those things are there for a reason and you should use them, right? All right, what's going on in the chat here? Anything I missed while I was in the DAW?
Aisha was asking about vocals.
Okay, where is that at?
I feel I have my vocals how I want them in my current mix, but they sound tinny and even a little too, quote, sharp. What do I even begin? How do I even begin to solve this? I think it might be specifically to, maybe it's phase issues. Like, are we talking a single vocal? Are we talking a bunch of background vocals?
Yeah, I don't think she elaborates on that.
I mean, if you have more than one vocal, you can, if you sing real consistently from one take to the next, you can actually get like phase issues because they're so similar that they cause some phase cancellation. So you can try like either trying to actually sing it differently or try a different microphone or different distance from the mic will change the tone enough to make it work. And if it's background vocals, one thing I saw later, something about
my vocals are also stacked.
saying the same thing at the same tone.
Yeah. Let's see. Is there less echo now? Let's see.
Oh, I can put on headphones too.
All right, cool. Yeah, I don't really want to hear myself at all. Yeah, so to just sort of give sort of, a few ideas, sound tinny and too sharp, I would look in the sort of high mid range. So like if I share my screen here, just to use the EQ, one of the things about the EQ is it's a great teaching tool, right? Because you can see where these areas are. So let's see. Let's go to the preset here. There's a vocal preset. Let's say bright verse vocal start, present vocals. So as you can see, there's a little bit of filtering here. I'm taking out the boxy nasally area. So like if you find that your vocals sound kind of like this, like if you cup your hands over your nose, it sounds kind of like nasally and sort of honky. That's sort of like the 300 to 400 area right there. And then nasally, if it sounds like, you have a cold, that's often an area. So like between like 800 to maybe 1200 can be an area of concern. But I was talking to a student yesterday. We were doing a one-on-one session, and we had a verse vocals and chorus vocals, and the verse vocals were much more tame, and then the chorus vocals were more energetic, more sort of yelly. And I needed to take a bunch of the mid-range, like the EQ curve kind of looked like that in the choruses, because as he started singing louder and straining his vocals more, that mid-range came out more. So you had to tame that. You can do that like this. You could also use a multi-band compressor to tame that area, right?
Yeah, I found like 2.6K. I don't know why that's it, but like on so many vocals, there's like one thing I used to think when I was young. So I grew up like singing in choir. My parents sing, and so my my mom would be pretty critical of other singers. So if there was a singer who was really nasally, like kind of sings like that,
Yeah.
She sings so nasally, and so you think then the opposite is you don't sing through your nose at all, but that's not true. We all use our noses, right? You can't like say an M sound without some sound, right? It doesn't work. It's like sound's going to go through there. Right. That's part of your sound. It's how much goes through there maybe determines the nasal sound. But everybody has like this nasal resonance thing that happens. I don't know if it's like the resonance of your skull or something, but there's something when you sing loudly, this kind of tends to come through. And especially when you're like pushing hard. Maybe not everybody. Maybe there's somebody who doesn't do it. But I find myself doing a lot of narrow, either notches or like even dynamic EQ kind of thing up there, because it builds up and it makes it to where you don't want to turn the vocal up because it hurts your ears, because that frequency is just annoying. But once you tame it, the vocal feels smooth and still feels bright, and you can push it up nice and loud. Yeah. So I wonder if that's one piece of the puzzle for Aisha. Maybe the multiple vocals are all building up in that upper mid, right around where it says probably piercing, be my guess.
Right. Because that is also where we're most sensitive. Our ears are most sensitive to. So that's the intelligibility area, and we're most sensitive to hearing that. And therefore, if things are really loud in that area, it's the easiest place to fatigue your ears, right? And so you have to have that. You have to really be aware of that when you're mixing that. Like everything can be sounding great and smooth, but if there's too much clarity, which is the same, because that's the thing, is that all these EQ areas have both positive and negative words, right? So if there's too much of 2.5K, it's harsh, right? But if there's not enough, you want to add byte. That's 2.5K, right? So like it's the same exact area, but we describe it differently based on like how we're feeling about it, right?
It's so subjective. It's got to be infuriating. Right. I remember I went to I technically studied audio in college, and like the final exam for one of our classes was you turned in a CD of a band mix.
Yeah.
And you listen to one song with like the 3 or 4 professors in the nice studio, and they listen, and at the end one of them goes, "Yeah, the drums are boxy. See ya." and I was going, I don't know what that means, and I guess see you later. And like I like for years I felt like I had no idea what he meant by that. What do you mean boxy?
Right.
Eventually discovered it, like the sound of a box. There's this kind of 400 hertz wah 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 thing that when you cut 400 on drums, it always sounds good. Always is like the one rule that actually works. But he could have just taken an extra sentence and told me that. But
yeah, exactly. It sounds boxy. Maybe look around 400. Bye.
Thanks. That would have changed everything. But yeah, I was like, I'm pretty sure those were drums, not boxes. I don't know.
Right.
So confused.
Exactly. It's funny. One of my final exams in audio school was mixing Bohemian Rhapsody on an SSL. What? It was all, it was cool, but it was designed for routing, so you had to like really understand signal path, signal chain, because there's just tons of tracks, right? And an SSL is inherently complicated because a lot of people that have never actually only seen them like in pictures, because it's not like you walk into a studio these days and there's SSLs, very rarely. But not only is it 48, 24, 40, in this case it was a 48 channel, right? So tons of faders, right? But it's also an inline console. Yeah. Which means that the faders on the bottom are like the basic what you're hearing, right? But there's also faders above that that are like your input faders. So like
the little faders.
Yeah, and that's independent of the gain of the preamp going into the channel strip, right? And then you're like, okay, then they say like, okay, I need you to group these things into a VCA and then send them over here, and then and you had to know all this. That was the final.
Couldn't you also apply the channel EQ either to the input or to the output fader?
Yes, I think that was like, it was either pre or post or whatnot, right?
Boy, I mean, that someone thought that up and then figured out a way to wire that up is fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, it's back in the day when it was called audio engineering. Now it's just called music production and beat making.
In Fruity Loops.
Exactly.
I was looking at who's that YouTube channel, In the Mix.
Yeah.
And I was looking at his channel because he's got like 1 million subscribers. I was like, where'd this guy come from? And his like top videos are all like how to do things in FL Studio, and I'm like, that's the missed opportunity right there.
Yeah. I'm just a simple logic person.
My wife and I have had conversations of like, hey, do you think if you'd stayed with Pro Tools, your channel would be more popular? And I'm like, probably. You know. I heard from I probably shouldn't mention this, but I heard from a plugin company that stopped using Reaper in their ads because Reaper is free, and so it attracts people that just want stuff for free, so they wouldn't buy their plugins. I mean, well,
so there, I think there's a little bit of truth to that. It's all about psychology, so much of the business side of things, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Let's go to questions. There's a third question here. Do you have a table of relative levels for different tracks, namely the lead vocal, background vocals, kick, snare, drum, standard mix tracks? Could be taken as a reference for static balance phase.
Table of relative levels.
Yeah, so you've probably seen this. It's like, I put my kick at -10, or I put my drums at -20, and all that. I think even Bobby Ozinski has like a table of that. That's like good starting levels. And I tried it, and I tried using it, and I just never end up. It just, maybe it's good for starting, but it just goes out the window immediately. Because maybe I'll try to make the drums like between -10, -20, and then everything builds around that. But that's about it. But I move the faders around so much, and especially when it comes to like relative levels of, for instance, a drum, right, or the drum bus, for instance. If it's peaking at -10, that's really only the kick and snare. It's not the drums themselves, right? So like, yeah, sure, the kick and snare are maybe around -10 to start. But then you add all these parallel chains and all this extra reverb and all this other stuff, and then those intro levels kind of go out the window pretty fast.
Yeah. For me, one of the biggest things you can do is, if you don't currently have like a set volume that you always mix at, like you have your whatever volume knob on your interface, you figure out where that needs to be, but then you just use that every time. Then it becomes a lot less about, okay, let me get everything at the right number. It's like I turn up the kick drum until it feels like a kick drum in my room, that I've mixed hundreds of songs in at that volume, right? It becomes a lot more intuitive sort of a thing. And where that number is, could not tell you. But also, like, I send you 5 songs with 5 different kick drums recorded in 5 different studios. How different are those kick drums going to sound, right? One's going to be real clicky, like your metal kick drum, that at the same fader level as everything else might sound way louder, even though maybe it's technically at the same volume because of the way it sounds, right? Or something with a crap load. We did my latest EP with my band. We had like a big 26-inch kick drum, just massive, unwieldy, like it's impossible to record, but we're doing it. But yeah, that thing on its own just has a different sound. So like, it's almost like the level is almost irrelevant, because every snare drum's even more, like a bright snare, dark snare, ringy snare, flat snare. Yeah, all that stuff.
Because like, even if it's at a simple level, if it's darker, it's gonna sound quieter, because there's not as much 2, 3, 4K, which is that your intelligibility area for your ears, so you can't hear it as loud, because those frequencies where your ears are, because we fool ourselves. Our ears fool us all the time. What you're 100%. Hearing is it's all made up. We're probably in a simulation.
It's all made up. We're gonna get unplugged here any minute. But you're right though. That's a good point. That like, it's that upper mid range where like we are, we're wired to hear the tiger sneaking up behind us or whatever. Those frequencies are really important. So like, your thing, if it has a whole bunch of those frequencies, I'm going to think, God, that's loud. Kind of like we said with the vocal. The vocal might not be too loud. It's just those frequencies. But yeah, that totally makes sense.
Totally. And and also, like, when I get tracks, before I even route things into my template, or even before I start volume balancing, I also make sure that the gain and the level of the regions themselves, the tracks themselves, are healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with if there's a track that was recorded too quiet, I just click the region and I just gain the entire region up so that it's loud, because otherwise I'm gonna have to crank the gain up somewhere.
You're
I
gonna crank
might
it
as well
somewhere.
do it at the start.
Yep.
Right?
And like now that like the whole, you may think, but what if it's clipping? It's like, well, it's all going into like this 64-bit engine that you couldn't clip if you wanted to, really, right?
Right.
I did this experiment in Studio One, and I'm sure it's true of all DAWs at this point, where I put like 6 plugins on the master, each turning it up 24 decibels, and then I put 6 right after it, turning it down each 24 decibels, and the audio sounded identical. So like,
Right.
if that doesn't clip, we're good. Everything's good.
Yeah.
Don't clip
Yeah.
the output, but everything in between is all the Wild West. You can go as crazy as you want.
Totally. And the only exception there is that if they are supposed to emulate analog
Sure.
gear, and they will saturate at a certain point because that's how they are designed.
For sure.
But I run into trouble all the time when I mix, and then I end up doing stuff in the template, and then I add parallel buses, reverb delays, and whatever. And at that point, maybe my mix bus is too hot.
Mm-hmm.
And often I just put a gain plugin at the top of the mix bus and just, -10 is fine.
It's fine. It's fine. It's totally fine. Especially if you like where the faders are. You don't want to pull all the faders down or go gain everything. Like, just, yeah, that is fine.
Yeah.
It's funny, we get in this place of like, oh, I can't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. You can.
Yeah. Nobody knows. Also, if nobody's gonna ask you, like, oh, hang on, oh, hold the Grammy real quick. Did you or did you not add a gain plugin on your mix bus?
What's funny is in Studio One, you can rename a plugin just on the tracks. You could call it saturation or give it some vague name if you're worried people are going to look at it and be like, you put a gain plug in there.
Yeah,
it's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
I mean, people on the internet are very attentive to what you're doing wrong.
People on the internet. Present company excluded.
Of course.
Chat, you're amazing.
Yeah.
It's the other ones.
All right. Fourth question here. How important in the context of comparing one's mix with reference tracks is to converge to the general EQ curve? So, like, using, and he mentions using tools like tonal balance by Ozone, or mastering the mix reference, stuff like that. Let's talk about reference tracks in general and maybe their relative EQ curves.
Yep. I'm not a big reference track guy in the traditional sense of like, I am mixing and now I am listening to something else and now I am mixing again. That doesn't mean I don't think it's good. And if I was starting over, that it may be different. But currently my kind of thinking on it is I get to where I know what a good mix sounds like in general.
Yep.
And then I know what a good mix sounds like here in this room between these speakers. And because I know that, and I'm regularly listening to music and kind of continuing to kind of hone that listening skill, then when I pull up my mix, it's like all the things that don't make it a good mix stand out. It's almost like a heat map. Like, oh yeah, this range is too much. This is too loud. That's too. It all doesn't conform to what I've internalized as a good mix, and so then I just kind of smack all the like whack-a-mole. I just smack all the things that aren't working, get them into place until it matches more my perception of a good mix. So that means I'm not switching over and saying, "Ooh, does that guitar match up with that Kings of Leon track?" Oh no, it doesn't. Right? Because it's a different song. It's when you try to match it, I don't think that's really the point. I think the point is you need to be real familiar with what a good mix sounds like so you can recognize when your mix doesn't have that. Does that mean total balance control is bunk? No. I just haven't felt the need for it, but I'm sure it's great.
I tend to use reference tracks when people want a specific sound. Maybe if like
Yeah.
they like the snare of this. Obviously, it's dependent on whether I can turn their snare into that. It's very has lots of different factors to it, but it often gives me an idea of like, okay, it's rounder. It has this sort of space to it. It sits here and stuff like that. That's very helpful for me because like I want them to listen to what they're expecting, you know, and if it's close enough to you know, in the last mix I did where I did this, where I'm talking about the snare, especially was this it was a country track actually, and he referenced like a Hank Williams Jr. song.
Okay.
So I listened to that and I was like, all right, I get it. You know, like this is where the snare is supposed to be, whatever. I used this plugin, which is really useful. It's through my Plugin Alliance subscription. It's ADBT, Metric AB. So basically, I import tracks in here.
That's cool.
And then it appears here as a waveform, and I can A/B volume matched to what my mix is, what's happening in my mix, and it's super useful. And I do a lot of custom mix tutorials, and sort of like I mix your song and then I show you how you do it, how I did it, so you can then do it yourself on other track or for your other songs. And so I use that a lot to make sure that I'm beating the mixes that they send me. Because because like don't hire me if I can't make it sound better than you. So I always like ask for like the rough mix, and also people get attached to the rough mixes often, and so you want to make sure that you're absolutely knocking it out of the park better than the rough mix. So that those sort of plugins help in that regard. But
that makes
I'm
a lot
the
of sense.
same as you. I'm not just bouncing back and forth all the time. It's also just a hassle trying to find reference waves and stuff like that.
Because you start flipping through. I remember years ago trying to just check to see if my low end was right on a master, which I'll do that more on mastering than mixing, just to say, am I in the ballpark? Yeah. If I feel like I've lost perspective. But then you go listen to a playlist of some of your favorite stuff, and like there's a wide range of what's acceptable as far as like low end in a master, right? So it's almost like I'm just going through until I find one that has the big boomy low end, like the one I'm working on. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm good, right? Because it's not like there's a set. This is the right EQ curve. There's an acceptable spot where we would all say that's too much low end, probably. Right. But that range is pretty wide. Also, it reminds me of that. Remember, I don't know if it's still a thing people talk about, but that idea of using pink noise to mix.
Yeah, I've never gotten into that.
I tried it once. I made a video and totally made fun of it. But it was this idea that you put on pink noise at a certain level, which pink noise is like white noise, but it's more balanced, I think is the idea. Yeah. So it's not as harsh. And the idea was you just push each fader up until you can just hear it over the pink noise, and that gives you the right level. And right out of the gate, I'm like, no way. But I'll try it. And so I did it, and the mix sounded terrible, of course. And apparently I did it wrong. You're supposed to like get all the EQs first and then do it. And I'm thinking, well, what's the point? I'm EQing it based on the levels I already had. Now I got to redo the levels based on your... I think the idea was it gives you a nice flat EQ curve. But like I could make something that has the exact EQ curve as a latest Grammy-winning master, right? Yeah. And could be made up of all that Icelandic folk instrument you were talking about, right? Like I could EQ it so that it looks exactly the same on a frequency curve, but it makes us all just cry and run away. So part of me is like, okay, the curve is fairly irrelevant.
Right. Yeah. But
if it helps you, it helps you.
Totally. But you know how your mix. Nobody's gonna judge you by how your mix looks.
That's true.
So like, don't know how helpful that is, but not to discount the value of meters though. At the same time, like I use frequency analyzers all the time. Span is my go-to frequency plugin. It's so super good, and it's for that to make sure. All right, am I being balanced across? Is there something I'm missing? Am I like not hearing something? Is something jutting out? Is the low end, abnormally quiet or loud or whatnot?
And I think too I know, is it Logic that has the AI mastering assistant thing? Yeah. Like I could see that being interesting. Like, hey, you do your thing to this mix and see what it does. Yeah. Just it really turned down the low end maybe maybe it is too much or something. Like, I think those tools can be really interesting. I
Yeah.
think you'll probably find that some of these tools you need at a certain phase of your journey, then later on you stop needing them, right? Like,
Right.
I
Yeah,
needed
you just
I
start
needed the
trusting
sheet
yourself.
music to have like a picture of the chord diagram, so I knew where to mash my fingers. Right. At some point, I stopped
Yeah.
needing that because I knew where to put my fingers.
Yeah,
I
you-
imagine
you-
these tools can be kind of the same.
Right. Like at some point things become muscle memory,
Mhm.
literally, and so I actually really like the mastering, AI mastering in Logic because of those things. It's interesting to see how it EQs things. It doesn't tell you anything else it does, which is a negative. Like, I don't know, is it
Interesting.
adding saturation? Is it
Right.
doing multiband compression? Like, what is it doing? I don't know, but I do see that it applies this EQ curve. And what it really does well, though, is it hits your numbers, like the perfect numbers that you want for streaming.
Yeah.
It just automatically optimizes your output for those numbers, which I think has value.
Mhm.
And then there's a loudness, or there's like a volume matched balance bypass that's helpful to see if it's actually making things sound better or not.
Yeah.
And I tend to not use like the exciter or like the width control or whatever. I just try to see how it sounds, and if the EQ curve is doing something crazy, then I'll maybe fix something in the mix, or there's a slider you can like turn down like how much of that EQ curve is being applied. And so it's been helpful to just sort of like get singles done.
Yeah, that's cool. Philip asked me how much AI is incorporated into Studio One. As far as I know, none. I'm not like against it, but I'm indifferent.
Right.
I'm
I think
sure
Logic just came out with an update that is like full of AI tools. I haven't downloaded it, so I wouldn't know. But it's there.
To me, it makes me think of like that, like those ads for like the MIDI chord packs. Like, yeah, if I didn't know how to write chord progressions, that would be helpful. I still have to drag each one in to test it out. So if there's an AI tool that like gives me a chord progression right there in the track, that's handy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I use AI for a lot of like different things, for business purposes, stuff like that. It's super helpful if you think of it just as an assistant. And so, and also like checks your work and stuff like that. It's like, what am I missing here? Read this over. What am I missing? Where can I elaborate further? Or like read through all of these survey responses and tell me what the big through line of what people want to know more about is. Like, I'll do that. And the same thing with music is like, if you think of it as an assistant, that's like, it's a bandmate of yours that you like, or a session musician in a way, and you just like, all right, give me a groove in E, like, and that's just, as long as you actually add some original creativity to it, then but if you're just like bouncing out loops, I don't know how much value you're gonna...
Friend of mine, Nathan Jameson Jones, he does like a lot of instrumental synth based music. His YouTube channel is pretty cool, but he just did a video about AI and was saying like AI is not doing anything original. It's just studied a bunch of music and is kind of putting all that together and to create something new. And he said, and that's exactly what humans do, right? No one's making a new chord progression today.
Yeah.
We're taking what we've heard and we're putting our unique spin on it. So I was like, that's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, LLMs are just trained on all of human knowledge, right? Which is exactly what school is. You just pick a topic because you just happen to not have the ability to learn literally everything. But like, your things are always going to be inferred or inspired by people that came before you and what you liked. Everything's a remix, as they say.
And like, if in 5 years we've got click a button to EQ everything in my session, and then I can go in and take what you did and tweak it more, like, I don't know.
Seems useful.
Especially if it learns, if it could analyze all my mix sessions that I have in my hard drive and then kind of mix it in the style of me. Yeah. That's kind of interesting.
That would be
does that mean I'm not going to want to sit down and mix something? Probably not. I'm still going to want to sit down with a guitar and write a song too, even though AI could do it. So like I don't feel threatened by it in any sense. If anything,
Right.
I see like if you're making a lot of money doing like sound for brands or music for brands, like they can just type it in and get it out. I could see that bit threatening that kind of career path.
Right.
For businesses who just want music, who aren't really concerned with the art of it, which I don't have a problem with that. It's just a thing. But yeah, I don't feel. If anything, I'm like that. It might be a cool tool that I'll eventually check out, but I'm pretty slow about this stuff.
Sure.
Somebody else figure it out, and I'll check it out in 2 years.
Because like it's the nature of creativity, right? Like you want to do this. It's fun. It's a creative outlet. You enjoy it. Hopefully, when I mixing is maybe or like processing audio, mixing most of the time, mixing or mastering is like one of the few places where I achieve the flow state.
Yes.
And so I'm sitting here. I have my shitty speaker on in mono, listening to something quietly, and I'm just completely there. Like one of the, it's the only times I don't check my phone all the time, or don't like tab back to my email. And so AI is not going to be able to take that want away from me, right? It might be helpful to like help me be faster in a flow state or whatever, but it's still a thing that you like doing, right?
That's so true. I just had it happen like a week ago. It was 2 hours later, and I didn't even. Oh,
yeah.
Probably need to go to lunch or whatever. Like it was just it's just fun. I love that.
Totally. Because you're just and I don't know if you find this, but because your ears are basically muscles, like after a few hours, you can start hearing your high end just being like it's like you're sore. Like your high end is sore because you've been straining your ears to hear, and you've been like when we think about focus, we're always like think about like open eyes, like really like in it. But what we are doing when we're just like opening our ears, trying to hear, is straining as much as possible. And then after a few hours, like you can only do so much before you're sort of diminishing marginal returns of good decision making, right?
Yeah. I get that. I did a live stream mix thing a couple weeks ago, and after about 2 hours, I was like, "We got to stop. I can't make decisions at this point. Right. It's just it's a start. I can feel it. Like the wheels are starting to just spin. It's not working anymore, and that's fine. And usually, it doesn't mean I have to go rest for a week. It's just maybe go to lunch and come back and you're good. But it's nice to give yourself a little break.
Yeah. We got a question here from A. Laird. Do you approach EQ moves differently for songs with 12 tracks or less versus songs with 50 or more? Yes, I would think so. I feel like there's a finite amount of room in the frequency spectrum. So there's sort of this inverse relationship that if you have less tracks, you don't need as much EQing, or you don't, unless it's just EQing to make things sound nicer or better or whatever. But when you have more tracks, you need more. You basically need to be cutting more. You need to be finding room for all these things, right? Creating better separation.
For me, it's if there's a bunch, we're talking 50 to 100 tracks, probably that means there's like 30, like I know one of my members he'll do like 30 background vocals, just like crazy amounts. But it's really, all that stuff is really just a stereo thing, right?
Right.
It's like a stereo keyboard, but I have to go mix all the parts to get them to blend together. But realistically, I get all those into a bus, I check those levels and panning, but then I'm really just EQing the bus.
Yep.
Because that is the sound. I'm EQing the sound of those background vocals with one EQ. Yep. So like in a lot of ways, 12 tracks makes me more nervous than 50. Because 50, I'm blending 20 tracks together and EQing them. 12, I may not have much to hide behind, right? There's only so many tracks. There's not a lot of... So in that sense, But yeah, everything goes through buses. So whether it's 100 tracks or 20, my main view of my mix and the way I think about it is, I mean, assuming it's kind of similar genre that I normally do, it's drums, bass, guitar, acoustic, electric, keys, vocals, background vocals.
Yeah.
Rinse and repeat. Maybe there's some strings in there. I'll make a new bus for them because they deserve their own bus. But it's a lot of what I call top down mixing, which probably isn't technically top down mixing, but it's doing stuff at the bus that makes sense. Kind of that name that tune. Can I mix this? Can I mix these drums in 3 plugins?
Yeah.
Let's try.
Right.
Most of the time the answer is no, but sometimes
Yeah, sure.
you can get pretty close.
And it's like I did a track a few years ago. It comes to mind because it basically had a symphony in it. And like a symphony is inherently, well, there's two. Well, actually, this had an orchestra, so it had like a few violin tracks, a few viola parts, few set cello, all this sort of stuff. Not a symphony, but an orchestra. It didn't have brass and all the tiny things, right? There was not a triangle track. But
Sadly.
So like I got that, and then I just balanced that with volume, and then you bus it to one thing, right? And you EQ that into the mix. And it's funny to think about it because when you record an orchestra, the general accepted principle of recording an orchestra is just using 2 mics.
Mm-hmm.
Is just using a stereo pair, maybe 2 stereo pairs positioned correctly. There's an old Wild West soundstage called Old Tucson Studios on the other side of the mountain here in Tucson, which had a bunch of John Wayne movies, I think some
Cool.
Clint Eastwood movies back in the day. So it's a typical 1800s Wild West town, and there's a giant sort of like barn dance hall there, and I recorded an 80-piece symphony orchestra in there. I feel like 10 years ago or something like that, and I did it with, I think it did it with two mics, 2 maybe 4 mics.
That's wild.
Yeah, and it was like a high school symphony, and it was just me and my friend Chase. You remember Chase from NAMM? He won the guy that won the Taylor guitar in the raffle.
Come on, this guy.
Wild. And so it's just the 2 of us, 4 mics, and 80 kids.
Yeah. I bet it'd be interesting to go back and redo that with the same mics you had, and then like spot mic every section too.
Yeah.
And then like have someone mix with just spot mics and I bet you get better.
Oh,
because I bet you get so off in the weeds with your 50 spot mics or whatever.
You're just asking for headaches.
Yeah, so much headache. That's interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, well, I hope that answered the question. We sort of went on a tangent, but that's what this is all about.
Like this.
Let's see. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody here. No questions here. I do wanted to talk about a few things that I promised I would talk about. Do you know, the Pultec trick, right?
Yes, the boost and cut at the same.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I've been explaining this to almost every single student of mine. And
I saw you talk about it at the drum mixing thing, and I knew it was a trick. I knew kind of what it sounded like, but I had never bothered to figure out what it's actually doing. So it was super interesting to see visually. Oh, that makes sense. That's what I heard. That's cool.
So let's find a Pultec. Here's this one should work. So this is the traditional Pultec EQ, and so often you will find that this works well on kick drums. Let's say you want nice low end on the kick, right? Like nice heavy thump or whatever. And often you can boost 4 dB, let's say 4 dB. But the Pultec trick is that you're boosting and you're attenuating, which is a fancy word for cut, at the same time. Now, that doesn't really make any sense, right? Because why would you be boosting 100 and then cutting 100?
The math doesn't check out.
Right. Or the math just cancels each other out, right? It isn't until you understand that the wiring and the curve of these, the curves of the boost knob and the attenuation knob are different. Mm-hmm. So if we, for instance, let's say here, let's find the shelf here. So this is the shelf, and let's find 100 hertz right here. And let's just for demonstration purposes, we're boosting about 15 dB right there. So this is a ton of low end, right? Obviously exaggerated for demonstration purposes, but as you can see, 100 hertz is right here where my mouse is, or where the knob here is, or the circle, and you can see that the curve goes all the way down to about, this is probably 300 hertz, right? And so what's between 100 and 200 to 250? Boom and mud, right? So you're maybe adding a bunch of thickness there that really pushes that low end of the kick drum, but you're also adding a lot of boom and mud potentially, right? And so what the Pultec trick does is that when you attenuate the same frequency, you're actually taking a bell curve, and let's say we're cutting the same 15 dB or whatever, you're getting this sort of curve. So you're getting a lot of the low end that you wanted, but you are also, ironically, cutting a lot of 100 hertz. But you're also taking out all of that possible boom and mud, which is why it makes that kick drum sound thick and focused, because it adds low end and takes muddiness, basically, right? And so you can also use this on a mix bus, but you got to be a little more careful and more subtle with it. So, like, let's say it's only 2 dB, because if you're at 2 dB, 3 dB, you're basically doing this to it. So you're adding some low end, but you're also making sure that you're not also adding a bunch of mud to your mix, right? So that's what the Pultec trick actually does.
Reminds me of some EQs when you have a shelf and you can adjust the Q control.
Yep.
It does that kind of weird dip thing.
Like a tilt almost.
Yeah. And if it can get real sharp to where it almost like has a boost up here and a cut down here, and then the rest is a shelf.
Yeah. So one of the my favorite sort of for distorted guitars is doing stuff that kind of looks like you kind of filter out the high end and take all that hiss in distorted guitars, and then my Q doesn't do that on this EQ, but then you maybe add a resonant boost on the actual frequency that's being cut, and then this acts as like the frequency or the curve that makes that guitar cut through the mix. So that works really well. So what you're talking about here is sort of like, if you increase the Q on this EQ, you do that. So this is sort of a resonant frequency on your shell, on your filter.
And people learned how to do this without seeing that curve, right? They had to hear like, oh, there's something. Yeah, that's impressive by itself.
Definitely. Well, very cool. Well, we're up almost up to the hour and a half here, and I was seeing if there's anything. Oh, one thing I did want to mention is that EQ pocket. This is also a very popular trick. Can be overused, so be careful with it. But it's often you'll have problems with, let's say this is a guitar track again, and this guitar is getting in the way of the vocal. Now, as we've talked about in the session, is that vocal has a lot of that energy in that 900 to 3K or 1,000 to 4K area, right? And so if that guitar in general also has a lot of energy in that area, and what happens then if both of them are fighting is that they're going to clash, and you might not hear either of them well. And so what I often do is I'll do sort of a broad cut of a few dB between about 1K and 3-4K here in the guitars. And let's say this is not on here. And then I'll find an area often around 1K where the guitar pokes through. So I'll end up with something that kind of looks like that. And so it's giving me a vocal pocket here, but in and around 2K. And it's cutting through, and the guitar is cutting through the mix below the vocal, but still in the mid range of 1K.
The old pocket trick.
Yeah, yeah. But you'd be surprised just how useful that is. And for those that don't know, it's often can drastically change their mixes for sure.
Love it.
Yeah. What else we got talking about? What do you have any more questions in here? Let's see.
We had like an email question that the fifth one you sent me, I don't understand.
Oh, it's like he's asking about the usefulness of specialty EQs like Guttfoss, God Particles, Soothe. These are all like automatic EQs that like are basically EQing all the time. They're useful. I use Guttfoss a lot. I use Soothe a lot. Soothe really helps smooth out vocal tracks that have been poorly recorded, or it really tames harsh cymbals, stuff like that. Places where just one EQ doesn't cut it, and once you start notching things like in multiple places, you're just basically butchering a track at that point. Often those like fancier auto intelligent EQs can be very useful.
Interesting. There was a question about advantages of hardware versus plugins for EQ in terms of pure sound quality. I get the question, but I also like in terms of pure sound quality, I don't know, because I'm not going to buy 24 channels of an EQ to try it out on a mix. You know what I mean? It's just not. That's not a thing. Yeah. I will say from a productive standpoint, if I'm doing like a bunch of background vocals, going through a channel strip that has an EQ built in, it's handy to go ahead and shape that sound on the way in, because I know I want to cut a bunch of mid-range or whatever. Yeah. Or it's like I'm doing like a beatbox thing, and I know I want it to have like a bunch of foom for like the kick drum sound, because you know me, I be beatboxing all the time. I've done it a little bit, but it's nice to go ahead and boost the low end on this EQ over here so it gets recorded that way. Right. Does that EQ sound better or worse than my plugin? I don't know. I don't care. It's kind of like the Helix or the 11 rack. Does it sound as good as the original? I don't know. But it sounds cool, and it gives me different tones, and it's useful to have something out of the box. But could I get by without any of this rack-mounted gear? Yeah, I'd be okay.
I think it's like it's cool, but it's negligible, right? Mm-hmm. And I think I saw like an interview snippet with Greg Wells, who I really admire. He's like the musician's music producer in a way, and he talks about like, yeah, I mean, I have all this gear, and sure, it might be giving me like 10% extra, but in the grand scheme of things, is that going to matter? Probably not, right?
And the fact that the analog modeled plugins are modeling any of that magic that was happening anyway.
Right.
So like if you have like somebody asked about SSL EQ, it probably, even without moving a knob, it probably imparts something to the sound that would have happened if you ran it through an SSL anyway, which is great. I don't know if it's great for SSL, but it's great for the rest of us. Right. No, I think they're doing okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, like you use those SSL channel strips, and they do add like a little bit of character, not a ton, and obviously not so that it just changes the tone drastically. But those EQs are cool. They're sensitive. They work well. But I probably wouldn't want to use a desk. I would love a controller, but that's for faders, not for sound.
I use a digital console, and literally the reason I don't think I'll ever not is just because of things like right now I can put a little bit of an EQ on this mic as I'm recording it in, so I don't have to EQ it later. It gets baked into the thing as I'm doing videos and stuff. So I've got a little kind of, it's the vintage EQ that Studio One makes, so it's a little analog style EQ, but on the mic on the way in. Yeah. Again, practically it's just helpful versus like, oh my goodness, it sounds amazing.
Yeah. It brings us to this question in a way, using the SSL EQ versus Logic EQ. So this is basically about, using a visual EQ versus an analog style EQ, where you actually just have to listen to what the knobs are doing. I love using both, as you may be, uh, as you might expect, because the EQ that I created has both.
Right.
So like, and it was designed in the way that it's basically I designed it. Let's clean reset this. Find something here. And so it was designed to be basically all the negative stuff is on the top. And I find that it's easier to sort of get rid of that stuff first with a visual EQ. So you might be cutting stuff out using subtractive EQ. And then once you've taken out all the stuff that you don't want, you might want to add some character to it, which is why these boost only knobs add power, tone, edge, bite, clarity. These are all fixed EQs, fixed frequency EQs. So punch, thump is 60, punch is 100, warmth is 160. They're all it's all in the manual. And originally, this EQ was designed to be only subtractive, just like this is only boost.
Mm-hmm.
So you could have only done this to it, basically. But then I realized that that's not really how a lot of people EQ. People like to be able to boost to find the frequencies and then cut. And that's what I like about these sort of sweeping visual EQ. Is because it's just intuitive in that sense.
I think of like the especially for learning, I say use visual only while you're still figuring out like what's the difference between 50 hertz and 100 hertz, because they're very different. They're just right next to each other, but they're an octave difference, right? That's a huge difference. But then also it's interesting to go use something like that's modeled after like a Neve, where there's only specific frequencies, and you may think, why is 360 hertz one of the options? But then you turn it and you realize, oh, okay, I can like boost that on guitars and they get warmer without getting muddy. That's interesting, right? Or I cut that on drums and they always sound amazing. So in some ways, I like to start with if the track already sounds pretty good, I like to start with just an analog kind of EQ and do kind of big picture shaping of the whole tone.
Yeah,
because you can, and they've chosen good options, but also I have a limited number of options, which is helpful too. And then if there's something specific I've got to fix, then the regular old graphical EQ, not graphic EQ, but the parametric EQ is handy for doing more surgical stuff where I gotta go to that 2.6K and notch that out. Analog EQ is not going to let me do that.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because all of these frequencies were picked by me because of what they do and how they make things sound. And it's all inspired by Neve, Pultec, the SSLs, all these, a lot of these sort of fixed frequency EQs, kind of like, you see it right here, because like 60 and 100 hertz is very common to click between and use. You can see it right here, 60 and 100 hertz. Warmth, I find that 160 is a really nice area for like snare, if you want a little more low end in the snare, acoustic guitar, places like things like that. Weight for guitars, 250. Tone this is basically my bass booster, so it's 330, so it's 330 hertz, and it just adds tone to the bass without getting in the way of the guitar that might be sitting there in 250, right? Attitude is 680, and that's where I often find keyboards like to live. You bring out that mid-range of the keys and sort of like just fits in the mix because nothing else is really there. Edge, 1.2K, perfect for guitars. Bite is 2.5. Clarity, this is just like if you want your vocals to pop through a little bit, that's add extra clarity. Same with presence. Brilliance, string sound on acoustic guitars, for instance. And then air and space, so it's 10 and 16 or 12 and 16, I can't remember. But basically, you open things up without you add high end without hearing more like without that harsh high mid, right?
Yep.
Because a lot of people are trying to crank that. They want their mix to have more high end, but they don't understand that, like, oh, it's harsh. Yeah, because you're EQing your mids, not your high end. You think you want high end, but you're actually way too far down the frequency range, because like that air area opens things up without actually sounding like it doesn't, it doesn't drastically change the tone as much as other places in the mid range, right? It just sort of like you hear things more. Yeah, that's probably why I call it air, because it's transparent.
Space. I like that.
Yeah.
Jorge said, I don't know about EQ, but hardware compressors are better than the model plugins. They probably are, just like a vintage Marshall amp is probably better than the model in my Helix. That does not mean that the model in my Helix isn't amazing and I can't make incredible music with it. That's the big difference. It's like, sure, a $10,000 335 guitar is better than my normal one, but I can still make great music with my normal one. I think that's where we have to, like, that statement is true, comma, but that doesn't make mine bad, right? It doesn't mean all the analog model compressors plugins are terrible sounding. They sound amazing. Like they literally, legitimately, like actually sound amazing. Would the other sound better? Sure. And if you want to go buy those, fantastic. That sounds super fun. I'm too lazy to set it up and then route stuff through it and then have to remember and take a picture of what the settings were so I can come back and recall those later, right? I mean, think about these big mix engineers that have these giant desks. They all go to in the box because that recall thing is the most annoying part.
Right.
Even though it sounds good and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just, it is what it is.
Totally. Yeah, and that's, you often miss the point there, is that the end of the day, it's the music that you're making that matters, not like the circuitry inside the boxes that the music runs through, right?
Yeah. I will say, singing as a vocalist, singing through a compressor on the way in, sometimes it's kind of like playing through a guitar amp that pushes back, right? There's a pushback that's kind of handy.
Yeah.
So having an outboard compressor for that reason, you could do it through a plugin. I don't do it all the time, but it's interesting.
I have a parallel chain on when I record vocals. I'll have two sends, one for reverb and one for parallel compression.
That's cool.
And just for monitoring purposes, of course.
So you can just send them a squashed version of themselves. Yeah, because if you're doing something where you're about to belt it, it's hard to belt if you know it's going to get real loud in your ears versus like, oh, that compressor's going to catch it and we'll be fine.
Yeah, totally.
That's interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's take maybe at least one more question here.
Yeah.
Tips on using dynamic EQ. I actually love using dynamic EQ more so than I use multiband compressors, because often when I reach for a dynamic EQ, or often when I reach for a multiband compressor, it's really because there's a particular frequency area that is a problem.
Yep.
And so because of that, it's actually just makes more sense to use. I use the Pro Q3, the dynamic section there. It's wonderful, and that's what I use. So I tend to use it a lot on bass, because oftentimes there's like maybe a note, maybe it's the fundamental, maybe it's the fifth, that just has more energy in some low mid frequency. And so when the track might be buzzing along, might be cool, really, really cool, and then he's like hitting a sustained note, and then that area only is like overloading 110 hertz or 124 hertz or whatever. And at that point, you use a dynamic EQ just to get rid of that. You're basically programming your EQ to catch only that area and only that time.
And it's cool compared to dynamic, or compared to a multiband, because multiband typically they can only go so narrow.
Yeah.
But if I've got this one frequency, that 2.6K, I can do a real narrow thing, and then I can say, don't EQ like that all the time, but when that vocalist sings an E sound and it chops everybody's face off, let's go ahead and tame that down and let's be aggressive with it. Because what's cool, at least with the one in Studio One, it's even the aggressive version is pretty transparent. Like it's not a super obvious thing. You can hear it working, but it's hard to make it go too far.
Yeah.
Which is kind of handy. And then I like to use it for a DS or two sometimes because it's right there. Just go ahead and I can see it in the spectrum where the S is happening, so I can just go deal with it right there versus closing that, opening a de-esser plugin, and trying to find the same spot.
Right.
It's just again, I like things that make it fast and easy. So
yeah, totally.
That's the ultimate.
And so and also when you have de-essers, you also can't think of de-essers as dynamic EQs. Especially if there is a wide frequency range that you can select from. Because, for instance, the Omni channel by Andrew Sheps has 2 de-esser modules in it, and even though they're labeled de-essers, I have used it to tame like 45 hertz on a kick drum because it's just a frequency dependent compressor. It's all that's all a de-esser really is. And so you can use it on whatever frequency you want. Just because it's called a de-esser doesn't mean that it's only used for S's, although that's obviously the original design.
So true. Yeah. Remember years ago there was a video on Wave's website about using a de-esser on like heavy guitars to tame the harshness. And I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah. And there's also I think there's presets in like the FabFilter de-esser that's like taming cymbals and stuff like that,
Makes sense.
Because it's like, it's just, some frequency that's too harsh and you're just smoothing it out, softening it. Yeah. All right. Any final words? We're at 90 minutes. I think we've cracked the code on EQ, don't you think?
We fixed it.
Yeah, nobody needs to learn anything else about EQ. No, it's a never-ending journey. I actually it's fun how you learn about EQ on every mix. You're always doing something different. Obviously, you often do the same old tricks that always work, like like you said, 400 hertz, cutting that out on drums and whatever. And 3K clarity, whatever. That's one of the reasons why those knobs are there on the Audio Issues EQ. But every track is different. Every piece of music will end up sounding slightly different, and you always are learning. And these are just your paintbrushes. Every work of art is gonna have different brush strokes, right? Totally,
completely agree. I think the bigger when I think people will ask, like, I want to learn how to EQ, I think it's important to realize what you're really asking is like, I want to learn how to recognize what sounds right.
Right.
Or how to recognize when something sounds wrong, and then how to hone in and find that frequency that's not right and fix it, either get rid of it or boost it or whatever. If you think in terms of that versus let me memorize how to EQ bass, it'll serve you a lot better.
Yeah.
Kind of like the whole like teach a man to fish, whatever.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that.
Right. Yeah, it's like you know what your goal is, like what's the objective here, and just understanding the areas and understanding like what you're trying to achieve, and also just knowing what sounds good, listening to a lot of music, knowing what your studio sounds like, how things translate. We didn't even cover mix translation, which is a whole separate section of EQ in a way, but yeah, so it's a never-ending journey and always fun. Shameless self-promotion, obligatory at the end here. The Audio Issues EQ is on sale for EQ Day, 50% off. I've already applied the discount for you, which really just means that I shot myself in the foot and have to stay up until midnight on Sunday, where I have to manually change the price. And so there's no discount code needed. It's all ready for you there at audioissueseq.com. It's instructive. It shows you the frequency areas and the corresponding vocabulary that we know and use to describe frequencies. So it helps you understand how to EQ while you're EQing your music. So it doesn't take you out of the session as it would if you had to, run over and read a book or take a course. It helps you work while you work. Hey, thanks, Joe. It's been
absolutely
great.
This was a blast. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, always a pleasure. It's always great talking to you. We always get into some fun conversations. So we got to do more.
Absolutely. Love it.
All right. Have a good weekend, everyone. Take it easy, and talk to you soon.